have asked some questions, but I think the speakers will speak like in the other panels for about 20 minutes each. And then we'll have a see if they have questions towards one another, right? Or picking up something from what was said if you were here before. And then we'll see if you guys have questions as well. And we'll start the conversation around IPS as we have done in the previous two ones. So with further ado, the order we will be speaking, Debbie Lisle from Queen's University in Belfast will speak first, then Grayson from Newcastle University, and then Nicole Grove from University of Hawaii. And we'll use that in this order. So Debbie, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everybody. I realize this is the third day of these roundtables, so everybody's probably totally exhausted. So thank you for making the effort to come. Thanks also to Joao and the IPS team, the Winter School team, for inviting me, and Renata for being the organizational and technological genius. So thank you so much. Joao had sent us all some parameters for these roundtables, and he framed those through sort of 4 questions, which, as Jeff explained, were largely about the kind of the genealogy of IPS, its heritage, its evolution, its intellectual lineages. I am not going to answer any of those questions. You have already heard 6 of my predecessors and my peers considering those questions very carefully over the 2 previous panels. But I feel compelled to respond to some of the claims that have been made over the past 2 days in regards to how IPS conceives of itself. And I've become really intrigued by, I might want to call it a kind of an affective atmosphere or a sense or a feeling that has been generated even over Zoom. And I guess the way that I would frame it is to say that I feel like I've missed a really important memo because I didn't realize that IPS had died and that these roundtables were some kind of like intellectual funeral. And so like an Irish wake, I'm in Ireland here, we're sort of, it feels like we're in this living room sitting around a dead body. And that's where we've been for kind of 2 days. So I'm looking forward to the part where we all get drunk together and share fond memories of the dead. But this feeling of lament has been palpable. There's like a real sadness that something beautiful that we created 15 years ago has somehow expired, or worse, that this beautiful thing we created has now turned into something unrecognizable, like it's a betrayal of what we hold dear. And I'm just going to read out some of the quotations from the sessions that I had written down. The energy is gone from IPS. IPS is what IR should have been all along. We've lost a focus on the international. The field is lacking in coherence. The identity of IPS has been hollowed out. What even is IPS anymore? So you can hear it in these kind of statements: deviance, betrayal, regret, loss, emptiness. So I want to say basically balls to all of that, because I am not sad. I am not melancholy. I'm not even pissed off at the state of IPS as a journal, as an intellectual project, or as a community. So I'm not going to deliver an elegy here. I'm not going to reflect mournfully on the dead and offer my own lamentation. I'm not going to outline how we might survive the coming stages of grief. And I am 100% absolutely not going to offer a strategy for repair or restoration, to go back to something we supposedly once had. So Oliver yesterday hilariously sort of said he didn't want to be Statler and Waldorf from the Muppets, you know, the men sitting on the balcony pissing on the show. Although I share with him some irritations and I'm very, very cranky. There's a lot of things to be cranky about, but the state of IPS is not the top of that list. Staying with the Muppets, I prefer Animal, the drummer. Unruly, energetic, unable to formulate any kind of verbal language aside from grunting, and quite possibly insane. So we're at least 15 years into this IPS project. And my question, I suppose, is why are we surprised that the original energy is now transforming? Ole suggested that at the start, IPS garnered its energy precisely because it was opposing mainstream IR, and that much of its early work gained its momentum from this kind of oppositional energy. I see the start of IPS actually quite differently. I think that the oppositional work had largely been done by comrades in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And IPS was actually precisely the place where we didn't have to have those fights over and over again until we die. Like, in a way, it was a place where we could say, who cares about Mearsheimer? I don't have to engage with that. So I understand the initial energy of IPS to be about possibility, experimentation, collaboration, and as some of us have said, the creation of a much needed thinking space. So for me, it was about figuring out how to cultivate heterogeneity, friction, and pluriversality within global political conditions that are consistently pushing us to resolve, to singularize, to find a solution, to fix the problem. We can think of IPS as our own version of Donna Haraway's invocation to stay with the trouble. And yet the problem of transformation continues to cause a great deal of anxiety. So the two questions that kept coming back are, what even is IPS now? And this notion that the field somehow lacks coherence. But in that lamentation, we've also heard some impatience. So for Oliver, IPS, as he says, is bloody hard work. And some scholars are simply lazy when they hitch their wagon to the newest, sexiest, big social theorist. Now, I share some of that frustration, and I call this the bloated walrus version of academia, where it's another heavyweight fight between two aging social theorists and their acolytes, while the rest of us do the business of feeding ourselves, finding shelter, and surviving, occasionally popping our head out to say, you know, boys, are you done fighting yet? For Ole, he says we simply have to get on with it and do the work. So I share some of these feelings of impatience and crankiness, but I refuse to craft them through some kind of lament or nostalgia, as if at some point in the past, there was a glorious period of IPS in which there was no fighting walruses. There was no lazy or terrible or sloppy work. I think this lament brings us into a really important development that I think we need to probe further. And I think Jeff and Ole both alluded to this, a really important generational difference that's emerging between, we might call it the founders of IPS on the one hand, and then the current formulations of IPS, largely animated, I would say, probably by PhD students and ECRs that are engaged in IPS work. Now, my own editorial team have heard this distinction articulated in various ways, that we have somehow let the journal go, that we don't do enough theory, that IPS is no longer a serious endeavor, possibly because we've gone too micro, to go back to to Jeff's formulation. We know, of course, that these two constituencies have very different experiences of heterogeneity and friction and antagonism. That's just a banal statement. But I think when the midwives that gave birth to IPS craft judgments through lament and nostalgia and loss, what happens is that we reproduce powerful claims about the proper way to do IPS that is absolutely inimical to what IPS has always been about. And the problem here is that I say we because I am including myself in this, is that we shove the labor of actually doing IPS properly onto the new generation. So we already somehow know what we're doing. We gave birth to IPS after all, and they need to simply do it better. They need to read more, know more, argue better. And this is what produces our obsession with questions of substance, of boundaries. What even is IPS anymore? IPS has lost its coherence. And we get seduced by this powerful temptation to bound it or codify it or label it and then use it didactically to teach others how to do it. Welcome once again to the problem of inclusion and exclusion. It's always a problem that is so tempting and so seductive. So I want to turn that around and suggest the opposite, that the problem might not be with what current scholars are doing with IPS or not doing with IPS. The problem is actually with us, with intellectuals like myself who've been swimming around in IPS waters for a while. We are the ones that have to do better. We are the ones that have to attune ourselves much more genuinely with the concerns of young and emerging scholars, not to contrast it negatively with our own supposedly lost youthful optimism, but to pay attention to how the international, the political, and the social are being looped through one another now, and how those, as Rob calls them, the ever important commas between the three terms are being formulated, understood, reconfigured, and pushed against. So I think in more practical or pragmatic terms, we old IPSers have to be better at things like supervision, at teaching, at mentoring, friendship, community building, and love. We have to enter these relations in a way that honors the openness of IPS as a project, with all its unexpectedness, its fractures, its liveliness, and its surprises. So this is not about entering an encounter on our terms or on their terms or on your terms, but on terms that we cultivate and co-produce together. And that means that none of our engagements can be didactic or authoritarian. All of them have to be stubbornly open to what might arrive. And it's no surprise that sort of the specter of Derrida is emerging. I think in a sense, we have to become much more vulnerable to each other so that we can co-produce and collaborate in the way that IPS encourages, in a way that helps us all stay with the trouble and not try to resolve it. Now, I don't want to underestimate how hard this is, how hard it is to stay with the trouble, because it requires, I think, a great deal of unlearning, untraining, and deconstructing. And this is especially the case, I think, with questions of method. Now, Oliver referred to an important tendency that all of us need to unlearn. And I spoke about this a little bit in the breakout rooms on the first night when I was distracted by the football game. But this is the practice of what we've come to call, and my editorial team, we've come to call applicationism. And we take that term from William Walters, where you simply apply an already fixed set of concepts or a theory to a bounded empirical problem. This, of course, kills the problem immediately. And the ghosts that remain, if there are any ghosts, are unbelievably dull. I can't tell you how many submissions to the journal we get that operate in that modality. Jeff referred to another tendency that I think needs to be unlearned, the idea that it's sufficient to somehow just simply telescope into the micro without then having to telescope back out again into the political or what's at stake. I think for me, the best work in IPS is always, always doing both. And it often doesn't distinguish between the micro and the macro, precisely because it's constantly in motion. It's looping in and out of these registers and multiple other registers to see how they're sticking together and falling apart. I think Didier also brought up some important points that take us into when we're trying to think about unlearning, that focus in a little bit more on the initial process of, say, research design or research formulation. And I'm really taken with his idea about the unfinished, the provisional, and the always in process. And I think some of the best theoretical work at the moment is actively exploring methods of speculation, experimentation, critical fabulation, and making. The problem, as we all know, of course, is that current structures of academic and intellectual life are actively hostile to any configuration of emergence that doesn't have an endpoint. It wants answers, conclusions, recommendations, and solutions. And for me, I think what all of us have to do in IPS is get better at articulating that well-known fact that all answers, conclusions, recommendations, and solutions, even and especially the ones we want to believe in so passionately about things like liberty, equality, emancipation, all of those always do violence to all sorts of life worlds, human and otherwise, and you cannot escape it. And so I think we need to ruminate a little bit more on the seductions of escape and to help each other stay with the trouble a little bit more and avoid that. So I think, I mean, for me, I would want to try to encourage us to understand that there is no uncontaminated moral high ground, no smug or puritanical political position from which to operate at either end of the spectrum. There is just the immensely modest hope that we might be able to shift the modalities of governance a little bit to collectively cultivate, as we know from Foucault, the art of not being governed quite so much. Now, this is, of course, immensely difficult to do amidst the interlocking pressures of academia as a vocation that are constantly trying to kill us. And here I'm talking about funding structures, tenure processes, hiring processes, publish or perish, marketization, adjunctification. I mean, you name it, you're experiencing it. I think that all of this labor of unlearning is actually best understood as a fugitive practice. It has to be done in stealth as we prise open the cracks of the hegemonic Anglo-American social sciences and humanities, and we try to inhabit those cracks together. Yesterday, Rob mentioned a sort of what I would consider an interesting collective mode of inhabitation, where he talked about the work that has to be, he called it ambitious, self-critical, and modest. Those all require a prior commitment to vulnerability. And as Didier says, we have to be more willing to inhabit disagreement or friction or turbulence, even with our best friends and our comrades. It's not about resolving antagonisms. It's about working with each other to figure out what's at stake when those logics take global form. So I think these ideas about fugitivity are really important when it comes to questions of collaboration. And that's where we get into this question of transdisciplinary work, which we had lots of discussions about. I can tell you from a personal point of view that I've learned much, much more about speculation, experimentation, and drafting from working with a visual artist than I ever learned from reading STS or ANT. So if anybody thinks that they can do IPS by staying exclusively within the critical edges of IR as a discipline, they're mistaken, because the transversal is irreducibly transdisciplinary, right? Going back to the point yesterday, the commas in between are important. So we had a lot of discussions about the discipline. I won't bore everybody with that because I know we've all pretty much lost the will to live. But I wanted to just offer some reflections on that tone or that affective atmosphere that I felt was being created, and offer my own sense of a much more, I don't know, energetic or positive account of why IPS is a place that excites me as a scholar, but also as an editor. And so I'd rather hear from, of course, all of you patient, thoughtful, and creative young IPS people. And so I'm going to now turn over to two of those. I'm going to go next to Kyle, who's one of the incoming co-editors of the journal who will be taking up in January. So over to you, Kyle.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Flattery will get you everywhere, because young is something I'm not called very often. Before I begin, I just want to thank the IPS Winter School team at Erie, Joao, and everyone, Renata, everybody who's here today. It's a real pleasure. I'm sorry I can't be there with you. I love you. I love Erie, and being able to be there in person and see everybody would have been fantastic. But this is almost as good, so I really appreciate the opportunity. I've played this a little bit closer than Debbie has, and it's probably reflects the difference between being DMOB happy on your way out and for Nicole and I entering the battlefield, so to speak, and knowing that we're at the start of our tour. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go through the questions, and I'll kind of signal to you what those questions are in case you forget or you haven't attended one of these. What I will say is that I'm going to start off and things are going to be reasonably coherent, and then they're going to start to drift off a little bit. And I think what you're going to hear are echoes of things that Debbie's been saying, but in a slightly kind of different syntax and grammar, including, that kind of underlying crankiness with certain things, but trying to be optimistic about what that crankiness can generate for us. So when I think of the history of IPS, and the question was, how do I understand the history and contributions of IPS within IR? So when I think of that history, my initial framing of it is institutional and disciplinary rather than kind of exclusively focusing on the intellectual. And in many ways being very much tied into the International Studies Association, a decade of reverberations and reactions to dissident IR within the field, and an absence of outlets for critical work situated within professional associations. So if you think way back when to the kind of turn of the century, you had alternatives, you had Millennium, sometimes you had EJIR, sometimes you had Review of International Studies, and security dialogue was only beginning to transform into what it's turned into being. But it's also a period, right, where you have the last vestiges of optimism of the immediate post-Cold War period dying, and particularly in the wake of the War on Terror. So there was not only a need for heterodox understandings of emerging configurations of power, but also a need for these to be protected, for a space to be carved out, for a certain kind of legitimacy that being institutionalized can give you. For that space, for the different strands of critical investigation to be able to come together and debate and dialogue. And as Debbie said, to be able to do that without starting off with 5 minutes of why what you were doing was important. So in many ways, IPS became a way of capturing shared characteristics of that which was taking place across various subfields and bringing them together. And primarily, though not exclusively, it was concerned with how contemporary relations of power are hysterically situated, contingent, relational, and multi-causal. Moreover, there was a skepticism of the binary thinking that divided discourse from practice and more generally structure from agency. So in sum, you had a full-scale rejection of the totalizing thinking pervading much of IR, IPE, and security studies at the time. And it was a call that sometimes the problem is the problem. So intellectually, IPS brought together something that was already there, but located in different sites. For example, concerns with how multi-scale relations of power, the social and international, are mutually constitutive, the stakes and consequences as these play out within specific contexts, and how these can then tell us something about the insufficiency of wider problematiques to capture the precise nature of the problem itself. So from my own perspective, the important emphasis IPS brought was not to neglect the social in our analyses of power and the international, including to bring an ethnographic richness to this engagement with the social. And the kind of point was to sufficiently understand the states through which power flows, you have to understand the actors, the field, the practices, the perspectives, and how these coalesce into worldings that have very real consequences. So for those inclined, IPS provided a space to follow discourse outwards from terminology, rules, and regimes of truth, right down to the points where force and resistance might intertwine. So in many ways, I think my response here echoes a passage from João and Jeff's initial editorial in 2012, and I just want to quote a little bit from this here. So IPS seeks to creatively work the modern categorical dichotomies of state and society, sovereignty and market, national and international, the social and political, nation and state, global and international, and community and society. To make this conversation possible, IPS calls for sustained engagement with the sites and events that reinvent and skew in unsettling ways what is called social and political. And this, I think, really nicely gets to a conversation that we had way back on Tuesday night about what IPS is. And to me, it's not a toolbox, right? It's not something, you reach into your IPS thing and take something out and then approach a problem with it. Rather, it's a place that encourages interesting questions. And I think there's another part of this too, and Rob could probably speak to this better than I can. One of the things I think that happened with the kinds of work that was being done in the 80s and 90s was that parts of the mainstream or mainstreamers took a real interest in it because they couldn't figure it out. They weren't sure if they needed to engage with it or not. And then when they had a sense where they thought they had figured it out, they just completely disengaged. And I think one of the nice things about IPS is it's kind of got around that problematic by, basically one, they can't figure it out. And two, we don't really need to care if they do or not. So when we think of the defining intellectual lineages of IPS, I'm going to go through this one quickly because you will have heard it all before. So I mean, clearly, right, there's critical social theory that's involved, and you know the names: Foucault, Bourdieu, Latour, Deleuze, Schmitt, Agamben, Butler, and on and on and on. And of course, what we're seeing now is a move towards the post or decolonial Said, Fanon, Du Bois, Baldwin, Membe, Mignolo. But what interests me are some of the things that seem to have somewhat dropped a little bit by the wayside. So Marx and Marxian thought, oftentimes Frankfurt School sometimes seems to get a bit lost, as well as Derrida, who Beto might disagree with me, but it often seems like Derrida has been the thing that's been jettisoned, or the thinker that's been jettisoned of late. And of course, there are also all the things that were happening in the 80s and 90s and people who were contributing that work from sort of across perspectives within critical IR. I think there have been some really interesting intersections with political geography, which have happened most recently. I think of Misha Shah's article, geez, it's almost 10 years old now, on getting out of the territorial trap of the territorial trap. But something that again was referred to the other night, that kind of spatial term and thinking of spaces, thinking what spaces do and thinking of how spaces function, I think has been a really kind of productive engagement. And of course, we're also starting to see and continue to see the new materialisms, assemblage theory, affect, all these kinds of things coming through. So when you put this all together, how then do I see the evolution of the field in the past decade? Again, things you will probably heard or read before. There's clearly been a move from engagements, I think, with sovereignty as a meta concept to the practices and understandings of petty sovereigns. We've had a turn, I think, often from theory to method, and this gets a little bit, I think, to some of the things Debbie was saying earlier, and we can think of things like the ethnographic turn. We can also think to the kind of incorporation of creative methods and what that has meant for IPS. I think there have been transformations and understandings of critique, and I don't think these are always necessarily positive. And I'm going to sort of identify two here. So it seems increasingly that being critical for some currents within IPS is simply a matter of eschewing monocausal explanations, and that's kind of enough. And then I think there's something that has been more productive, which is to turn the critical gaze back on the antecedents of IPS, of dissident IR, and kind of, you know, then turning back and thinking about what exactly are these things doing, what are their limitations, and in what ways might they constrict the ways in which we look at problems and establish problem framings. There've certainly been moves, and this is sort of more in line with my own work, around aesthetics and culture. And again, I think there are two ways in which aesthetics has been deployed to understand sort of connections that bind and recombine the international political and the social. So you have, say, the work of people like Roland Bleicher, where aesthetics is basically a method of interrogating the inevitable gaps between sign and signifier, right? And that's where politics takes place. It's that kind of move to put what is being signified and making it into the sign. But then you have the work of somebody like Mike Shapiro, where aesthetics plays out in a slightly different way. And it's the eschewing of the assumptions of homo economists and moving away from the psychological motivations or interests of subjects to focus on things like how mobilities, encounters, and ways of living can tell us something about our worlds and the ways in which we world. And so what I think is broadly more interesting in this is you then have a shift in terms of how culture is being engaged with and moving away from it as an essentialized explanatory variable of last resort to, again, using Jeff and Joao's terminology, it's a fracturing element, and it draws attention to practices and histories that work across the international, political, and social. And by looking at culture in this way, I think we can focus on how it can connect elements that we otherwise might think are disparate. And work that takes culture seriously can challenge the understandings that would otherwise be reproduced by ideal types associated with various strands of IPS. And what I think culture can be really good at is identifying the repertoires that we use, the things that we know without knowing, the modes of interpretation, practices, and shared narratives and shared meetings that help us to make sense of the world and navigate it. And one of the things that's interesting here is it gives us a way into understanding how things become sticky, that kind of resonance. Why do we see the reproduction of the same kinds of problematic things in different places, in different sites, through different channels? So this then gets us to the kind of final questions that were thrown our way, which is one, what would we say is the importance or contemporary importance of IPS for rethinking the international? And then the part which I really stuck my teeth into, which is how do you see its main challenges in the near future? Because I've got to think about these very carefully with Nicole. So the glib answer to what's its contemporary importance would be that kind of ongoing sensitivity to the who, where, what, why, and how of the international. That is to the production of inside outside and a focus on how boundaries continue to be drawn, maintained, thickened, erased, and reoriented. And I think there are some different vectors along which the international is being reinforced, challenged, and reconfigured. And I don't think any of these are going to come as a shock to anybody. So of course, one is the virtual and digital. And I think in more than one way here. So you certainly have enclosure, both in terms of this as a site of property, but also as virtual practices of control. Kind of think of Deleuze and the control society and the individual. As a return of empire, and empire in different kinds of ways, empires of meaning, empires of affect, and also sort of empires of business and commerce and control. And then I think there's another thing with the virtual, which is that kind of complete dismantling of the problems that framed older forms of social order. For example, privacy and anonymity is eagerly traded away for access to particular things. We then have the ecological, and in particular, how does a system or systems predicated on the assumptions of the international, territory, time, and the human manage a biosphere whose composition and dynamics occur in complete disregard for them. The third, I think, is racial, the color line, the descendant of Europe, however we want to frame it. And I think Sanjay Seth's distinction between the two strategies here is really important. So you have one, right, which is about placing Europe into the periphery of history or analysis, but we continue to use the same categories, the same theories, the same methods to do this. But the second is about undermining, as he says, quote, universalist pretensions of social science by carefully considering how imperial, colonial, racialized logics permeate our modes of thinking. But I think there needs to be some care about the implications, particularly there's an ethical methodological question of how ontologies, epistemologies, concepts, theories, and methods may reproduce racialization and racialized social political orders, how they actually do so in practice, and if and where there are possibilities for redemption. I'm going to quote Mustafa Pasha here, and it's to say that it's a question of how the interpretive analytics offered by a thinker or approach enable us to examine the, quote, contradictions and apioras inherent in processes of deterritorialization and reterritorialization, or in dream worlds conjured by cosmopolitanism, but also in the darker worlds produced by exceptions. So then I'm going to get to the challenges, and this is going to be like rapid fire, drive-by shooting kinds of things, and we can pick this up in the discussion. So the first is I think there's a tendency in some work to create a false dichotomy between the everyday and the international, where the everyday is kind of this right-on space where power and the international is challenged. And of course, in many ways, the everyday is actually the pointy end of the stick here, and kind of thinking through the ways in which these things intersect and not taking those relationships as seen. There's another question, and this is, I think, the flip side to what Debbie said about transdisciplinarity, and I'm going to call it the grass is greener and the chocolate's covered salmon problem. And I think it's the danger of an unreflected transdisciplinarity. So there's oftentimes, I think, a little bit too much contempt for where we're located, and including contempt for those things that we see ourselves as being a little bit beyond. It might be that we might not like more orthodox approaches to the international and the sorts of things they do, but I think there is some danger if you're not prepared to engage with them, to look at them, to try and see what they're doing, to try and see the ways in which they frame things and why those have a currency. So just because somebody else is doing something different somewhere else, doesn't necessarily mean that we should do it. So we need to think about the conditions that have created the space of opportunity to draw on other disciplines. What's maintained a previous separation between our fields and others? What's gained by going in, both for us, but also for the other field? And is it really necessary? And this is the chocolate covered salmon problem of it. You know, just because you can, should you? Is the transmission two-way, right? Is this a dialogue, or is this just some kind of foray, right? A raid, and kind of unreflexively pulling something in. And I think it's, you know, avoiding the kind of add X and mix. And this again gets to issues that Debbie has also raised. Then I think there's another problem, which is the, and I say this being located in the global north, the save us from ourselves problem, and the challenge of the global south. So there's a pervasive dirty liberalism that sees the challenge as one of extending privilege and being inclusive, right? You know, come on in. We all know you want to be, you know, where we are and doing what we're doing. On the basis that whatever is going on at particular sites that are otherwise exclusive is inherently of value and in demand more broadly. And I think we need to think very carefully about that. We need to think about what the global south is, where it's located, and its conditions of possibility. And oftentimes I think colleagues with good intentions don't do that. And then there's an issue around exoticism, or maybe if I was going to be slightly more generous, a kind of naive optimism. And for me, this is a reverberation of the problematiques for political theory from the time of first encounters, right? You know, what do you do? Oh my goodness, you know, here are all kinds of other groups who don't believe what we believe, who are operating in very different ways. And what does this mean more broadly? And that is that there's something inherently pure in the global south that, if harnessed, becomes a progressive solution to the shit we find ourselves in. And as those of you on the call will know better than anyone, location does not determine political sensibility. And I think particularly some colleagues in the global north forget that. So I think a shift in impetus is needed, and the problematique requires a rethink from one that's exclusively understood as issues of inclusion to one where people like me, who will be stepping in and taking over a journal, start to think about what we're actually asking colleagues to become a part of, and if this has any attraction for them intellectually, socially, professionally. And then the thing that I'm going to end on is what I call the matrix of banality. And this, I think, gets to, again, some of the issues that have been talked about across panels, but also in what Debbie said. And try and visualize a moment, kind of a table, 4x4 table, and kind of running across the top is to think of, I don't know, it's a typology, I suppose, of papers, right? So You can have, on the one hand, kind of in column one, the thick description, kind of empirically driven, or I'm going to describe what a theorist has said to you kind of paper. Then you have a second, which is the application of a theory to explain a case, and generally that's to verify the theory, right? If we use Foucault to look at airports, here's what it tells us. Then you can have a third column, which would be the application of a theory to something for the purposes of problem, for the purposes of understanding the problem and adapting and revising the theory as necessary. Now we're starting to kind of move up a level and I think begin to get a little more interesting. And then you kind of have that final column, which would be an interrogation of a meta concept or a question or a problem framing through theoretical work, such that the meta concept or problem framing and its foundations are adapted, revised, and advanced. And there, I think, right, we get to things that become super interesting. That's very difficult to do. But that's, I think, you know, the sorts of things that we all, to the best of our ability, ought to be aiming for. And then if we think of the rows, and this comes from, I think, my own frustration. I'm a bit tired of reading things where the conclusion is that such and such is problematic, because you know what? Everything's problematic. So how is it problematic? So we can have the conclusion as a row, something is problematic. We can have a second row, which is here is how this thing is problematic. I think we can have a third row, which is here is how this thing that's problematic connects to larger problems. And then the kind of fourth row here, and kind of in many ways the gold standard, if you think of this in terms of rethinking problem framings, is here's how this problem, how this thing problematizes the premises of a broader problematic, potentially changing how we can pose key questions. And so thinking along the line, right, as where work needs to be done, I think it's sort of on the extreme right-hand corner of this matrix. It's what we need to be looking for. And it goes back to what I said is, for me, being one of the key lineages of IPS, that the problem is sometimes the problem. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass things on to Nicole.
I want to first thank the Winter School and Joao especially for inviting me to participate in this conversation, and also thanks to Debbie and Kyle for their comments, which have given me a lot to think about. I almost feel like Debbie should have gone last because I also, you know, I think maybe I was feeling a bit of what Kyle described in terms of the kind of maybe ingoing, outgoing perspective, and that's how I was sort of approaching some of these questions. So I did address each of Joao's prompts that he had forwarded to us, and so I'll frame my comments around those. So the first was about the history and contributions of IPS as we understand them within the discipline of IR. So when I think of the intellectual contributions of IPS, it's usually in terms of, first, the more disciplinary contours that center around particular thinkers like Foucault, Bourdieu's work on fields, the practice turn, and also work that's drawing on political theory, sociologies of migration, policing as a structuring practice in society, as well as how social insecurities become politicized through things like, for example, border control. And I think this is an incredibly productive way of disentangling and mapping the effects of various policing and security apparatuses that are operative in our lives in these very transversal ways, and also thinking about how power or sense or habits are formulated through formal and informal structures using thick description. Now, I think the second intellectual contribution is much broader, and I see it being part of, and again, I'll apologize because I feel like maybe this has sort of been covered throughout the week in various ways, but I see it as being part of an engagement with a distilled set of questions that have preoccupied what we often refer to as the critical turn in international relations in the late 1980s and early 1990s. You know, and I think that even though these questions are kind of decades in the making, in many ways, critical IR, however we want to define that, is still grappling with them in some form today. And I think in IPS is this intellectual space for which those questions can continue to be examined, and where we can explore them in the context of contemporary crises. So, you know, even though we're no longer asking, you know, questions around like whether or not the state is the most significant actor in IR, we're still writing and thinking through how to talk about the state or what should be included in international relations. We're still thinking about the contours of sovereignty, challenging the order-disorder binary, the role of culture in international politics, the normative descriptive problem, the role of the expert, right? And also questions around transdisciplinarity and what counts as IR. So I also want to point out another contribution that was mentioned, which is its institutional contribution to things like around things like the ISA section, and also the journal, which I think continues to support scholars, researchers, and students who do want to challenge, you know, dominant, often violent orders of knowledge around global politics. So I think IPS has always been kind of held as this special place in the academy for outliers. I think for people who kind of want to build a better world through collaboration and ideas. And so I will say, you know, I haven't been privy to these conversations over the week about lamenting and dying, the dying of IPS. I'm really excited to be, you know, working on the journal with Kyle. So I definitely feel a lot of enthusiasm about it. I don't feel that sense of lament at all. So yeah, I mean, we can talk about that more, but you know, and I think part of that has to do with, I think, the kind of ethical and practical value of it. You know, I think it has this ability to adapt methodologically to our contemporary condition, right, to these current crises that we are living through. And I think, you know, IPS is really well positioned to be a space where, you know, we can account for a very diverse and a changing world that is driven through methodological development and its application. And I think it can be deeply pluralistic. You know, I think it being pluralistic doesn't always feel good. I think pluralism can be painful, especially when we're thinking about ways of applying it sort of practically, what that looks like in practice. You know, but it has been, I think, and continues to be a space that can be leveraged to hold open, you know, creative thinking that are inherent to research questions that are emerging through reflexive and through kind of grounded work. So the second question that we were asked is, what do we consider to be its defining intellectual lineages? And I wanted to make a distinction here between lineage and archive. And to be honest, I think more about the latter. Like, I think more about the archive than I do about lineage. Part of it is just because lineage is kind of a weird word for me because it makes me think of pedigree. And I think it's a particular model of the academy that I don't really identify with, or I have a kind of resistance to, or have an uneasy relationship to. But I do understand the importance of having an awareness of the trajectory or the sequences of readings or experiences that have led us to kind of our unique moments in the academy. And I think this is all true, while I do, you know, I don't think it's possible to reproduce someone's scholarship just by reading what they read or citing what they've cited. You know, scholarship is not created in a vacuum. It's a relational enterprise. So I think the archive means something a bit different. And I think our archives are texts, you know, that we choose to engage, but it's also about the kinds of responsibilities that we take on when we are trying to describe the world. You know, when we tell our stories, and this includes the work of telling origin stories, but also when we tell other people's stories. And I think, talking about the archive and thinking about the archive is also about the ethics of working in an archive and the kinds of scholarship that we produce and what we want it to do in the world. So, I think in some ways, maybe my answer to this question of lineage is a little bit unsatisfying, but I do believe that how you place yourself within an intellectual community will shape your understanding of what your lineage is, as well as, your archive as this living and breathing thing. Now, for me, when I was growing up in my intellectual community as a graduate student at Hopkins, there was this very friendly relationship between international relations and what William Connolly calls the minor tradition in political theory. So we were reading a lot of Foucault, Nietzsche, Spinoza, Deleuze, but at the same time, when we were learning about IR, we were doing so through the work of Césaire or Fanon. I wasn't reading Waltz at Hopkins, or I wasn't reading him regularly. And so, I was reading discourse on colonialism and then trying to put those texts into often very uneasy conversations with one another. So thinking about post-colonial IR and this minor tradition together. So I think the combination of those things, and then also an interest in policing, and then being at the University of Hawaii, where Mike and Krishna are also located, I think those are the things that brought me to IPS, rather than reading this sequence of texts that were just built upon one another. But, I also want to acknowledge that there are many people who have found a home within IR through the institutional resources of IPS and allow them to do things like reflexive ethnography or field research, but they're not necessarily engaging these concepts of fields or habitus or sense. They might be working with folks like Anna Singh or Saidiya Hartman's work on archaeologies of Black memory, or Ann Stoller's work, on race and Foucault, right? Maybe this is a more useful archive for them. So I think if your research makes more sense to you and your interlocutors when understood through these other theoretical lenses, then I think that is like how you're building your archive. So, maybe if I were to put all of this together and try to kind of come up with some form or way of describing all of this is related to IPS, maybe there's a kind of ethnographic sensibility that informs understandings of power that cross these kind of different elements that I've tried to describe, or maybe ethnographic sensibilities around violence that Vincent calls the resifting of personal experience in relation to our research and being in the field. So I think more generally also, whereas this inside-outside problem of IR really does continue to confound people in the field, I think IPS remains an intellectual project and an institutional space that allows us as scholars to kind of move from polity to polity and to still attend to the way that history moves, the way that power operates, and also to look at these more opaque registers that don't necessarily always adhere to where we think the supposed action of the international takes place. The third question was, how do you see the evolution of the field in the past decade? I would say, as a community, there are more and more people who want to make IPS an even more hospitable place for exploring questions around policing, around borders and security outside of this general framing of what we might call the Anglo-American corridor or from the global South. I understand that this is a very problematic term, and I've had several circular meetings and discussions around like how this should be defined. But I think the thing to know is that these concerns don't always translate into concrete practices that address the structural barriers to proliferating these engagements in more thoughtful ways. And this was something that Rob Walker was writing about in the 1990s. And I think there is, now more of an attentiveness to how to do this in practical and concrete ways, rather than simply articulating a need for it as a kind of perfunctory acknowledgement. So obviously the winter school is a response to this. Some of the work that I've been doing with the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, where we have a summer institute on critical security studies that I've created with some colleagues of mine. I think that is a response to this, in part because pretty much the entire summer school is conducted in Arabic, or it's done with concurrent English and Arabic translation. I think also through these different institutional encounters, we are taking up issues around the supremacy of European languages, the politics of translation as a component of what we hope makes IPS a lively project, and how we draw upon theoretical contributions outside of the Western canon, in an effort to negotiate these different kinds of tensions, to question some of the parameters for thinking about the translation of concepts and frameworks in these contexts, but also to just proliferate encounters with scholarship in other parts of the world, I think, that are already considering the relationship between the social, the political, and the international, maybe not through the terms that we use, but maybe through questions of violence, for example. And so I think focusing on the active processes of translation, away from this relationship to the, at least we should be attentive to it. I know we don't always do it perfectly, but, I see us sort of like, as journal editors, kind of moving away from this relationship of tutelage and trying to proliferate kind of more horizontal encounters with these concepts, with these frameworks, with languages, as having a situated meaning for the people that are using them. The last question is about the contemporary importance for rethinking the international, and also how we see IPS's main challenges in the near future. I'm really excited about how IPS will continue to engage the relationship between the politics of security and its intersections with data flows, with technological systems and the built environment. So I think maybe my answer to this is more specifically around kind of issues and questions that I'm interested in. That's just one of the places, I think, within this IR community where this work is being done. And I think, there are infinite numbers of ways of examining the impact of data-driven technologies, of surveillance, of security, of data capture, and also how these systems are shaping ongoing transformations in space, which Kyle mentioned, in mobility, in conflict, as well as the ethical and practical implications of these transformations for people's lives. So I'd like to figure out ways for IPS to continue to investigate these problematics from a really wide range of research locations and methodological perspectives that help us to rethink and reformulate, I think, this really kind of stuck geographic binary between the West and the non-West, and also to kind of highlight the complex social and political worlds in which technical solutions are crafted and are implemented, and as well as how the historical and contemporary drivers of security and technological change are rooted in relations of power, of marginalization, of exploitation. I'm also really interested in, I think, what I might call the planetary drift of carceral reason, and how IPS can kind of intervene here. So the kinds of questions would look at the kinds of security politics and geopolitical relations that are driving the global dissemination of technologies that are used for surveillance and other forms of carceral enclosure, and how technologies are designed for other purposes, are pulled into the gravitational sphere of global security and surveillance assemblages and regimes, and to what effect. And then, another area that I'm interested in, that I think IPS can intervene in some cool ways, is how we can think about the shift from public spaces to media spaces, as well as how elite-driven media sources are kind of, we're shifting from elite-driven media sources to user-generated content, and kind of multi-actor information ecologies of disinformation and misinformation that are altering capacities for community or communication and control. And then finally, also really kind of interested in this question of design and crisis. I know there's some cool work also being done around this topic, international political sociology of design, which I'm just sort of familiarizing myself with now, but there's a lot of other work on design and security that I think have a lot of promise for answering some of these problematics that we've kind of discussed, or that I've discussed earlier in the presentation. And this really looks at the kinds of life worlds that are being designed and deployed in surveillance saturated spaces for commerce, but also for security and living, and looking at how certain kinds of states of exception are becoming the new normal. I think maybe I've gone over time. I'm not sure. I wasn't looking at my stopwatch, but I'll stop here and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Nicole, Kyle, Debbie. This raises similar question last, but also very different ones. Do you have, like last time, like the last two other ways, do you have any questions, comments you want to pick up from one another? Anyone? Debbie, not? Kyle? No, Nicole neither. Okay, then we're going to open it up for questions, comments, remarks, and please feel free, if you've attended all three, to to bring them in from what you've noticed in the discussion and the presentations around IPS. You can put up your hand. I think another people can put up their hand, or they can write something in the chat that I can actually pick, that we then can. Yes. Rita, I'll keep an eye on the hands and make a list. So just put up, oh no, it will list anyway. So put up your hands. Rita?
Yes, hello, good afternoon. My name is Rita, and I'm a PhD student in international relations at the University of São Paulo. And my question is very objective. Being this the only panel that I noticed that there are two women, I would like to know how gender is today studied, considered, discussed in IPS. Thank you.
Does anyone want to pick that up?
Yeah, I'll pick that up.
There's no more hands at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Rita. That's a really good question. I want to say a couple of things. The team that that I work with for our editorial team, we are all women. And over the course of our time editing the journal, we publish more women than we do men. And so the representation question of gender is a good story. What's an even better story is that wasn't a explicit strategy, in the sense of, like, we didn't sit down with each other and say, well, we should publish this paper because it's from a woman at all. It wasn't about that. Those are quite sort of logics of representation, meaning that, they work in interesting ways. The thing that I have been thinking about a lot lately with respect to gender, so that's like a kind of institutional question, and it's a good story. The ISA loves us because of it, but that doesn't mean the question of gender goes away. It doesn't go away. Like, it's not like we have succeeded now, okay, everything's great. It doesn't. And one of the other institutional problems, of course, is with COVID. We're now seeing a total fall in submissions from women, of course, because of the unequal load of care. I mean, that's a conversation we can have. But the question for me intellectually is one I don't have an answer to, and I'm troubled by it, because part of what I see happening, I'm seeing an enormous amount of energy and brilliance and theoretical sophistication and addressing these like irresolvable problems around questions of the decolonial, and certainly around questions about race, Afro-pessimism, all that. There's just this enormous amount of work going on. It's vibrant, it's exciting, there's lots of antagonism, it's going back and recovering all these histories in different ways. And to kind of reflect back on some of what Jeff was saying yesterday about the micro, I'm not seeing the same sort of conceptual theoretical energy around the space of gender. What we're seeing is lots of micro analysis of micro practices about gender, not just about representation, but all kinds of ways that gender is formulated in the public sphere in relation to violence, etc. But something has happened, and I'm old enough to kind of have an arc of when I remember about feminism in IR. There's something has happened, and I can't figure it out about what is happening with respect to A, feminism, and B, gender analysis in IR. Maybe it's the case that like everybody's doing it, so it's dissipated and it's fine. This is not the same kind of lament. I'm not doing a lament. I'm saying there's some shifts that have happened, and I don't know what has happened with it. And that's also with respect to IPS. So we have a good story about representation, and we can talk a lot about that, and it's important. And I know Nicole and Kyle, we've talked about that as well, but there's a bigger issue, problem, set of questions about the way we are conceptualizing and understanding and studying gender. It may relate to some of what Jeff brought up yesterday about a kind of identity politics and the kind of return of the 90s version of that, but I'm not sure. And I haven't actually worked it out. So I would really welcome, you know, why are, like, so it sort of feels like we've stopped with Judith Butler. Like that was the last person we all kind of read and got excited about, and other than Lauren Berlant, but that's more about effect, etc. But like, and yet in questions about race and decolonial, it's just this explosion of all this kind of work. So anybody can give me any sense of why they think the energy is different. I would love to talk about that.
Do we have more hands, questions? I'm going to be silent for a while so people can actually get themselves to put their hand up.
Maybe I can answer Debbie's question in part. I mean, my sense is that it partially has to do with something we've talked about before, which is just that kind of sociology of knowledge and what you need to do when you're starting out, and that kind of distancing from, you know, what has been in the past. And I think in particular, seeing now how much, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, this is just more a descriptive comment, the focus on intersectionality, for example, and how that then begins to shift the conversation. And so, and as part of that, the identity politics that then comes with that, I can see for many colleagues who are doing gender work, that you almost feel like you've got to start covering a whole lot of bases in ways that you wouldn't have done before. And so that, you know, we're continuing to see gender work. There's lots of gender influenced work that's being published within IPS, but, you know, more broadly within kind of heterodox IR. But my sense would be that may be what we're, you know, the direction of travel on.
Raquel?
Hi,
Sorry.
can you hear me fine? Yeah. I'm, you know, having, you know, participated in this winter school since the beginning, I still find myself confused about not so much of what IPS is, but what makes it different than, you know, other approaches, other methodologies, other kind of, you know, theorization. And I guess my question kind of also stems with what just been said, you know, like why, like, I mean, if maybe IPS is not focusing or hasn't seen so much theorization around gender, if that's actually the case, I mean, I could still find plenty of that in other journals, right? The international, what's it called? Journal on Feminist Politics, or, regarding critical security studies, I can still find, work coming out on security dialogue, or, Third World Quarterly. I don't understand what makes IPS special or different from all these other approaches that, still focus on the global, still focus on, post-colonial, decolonial, and other things. Am I making sense? I don't know. I just see all these discussions happening in so many other places. I don't understand what. And another thing that also is, if I may just take the moment to ask another kind of loaded question. A lot of the texts that we've been reading in this course comes around as being quite complicated, and I can't help to think to myself, what do these concepts really mean when we talk about more practical things, or how would I be able to explain these things to students or to the people that I work with when it comes to activist work? I mean, it's almost like it's like a redundancy in talking about the global with, let's say, a young activist who is working on the global level, it's not lost on them that there's these intricate connections and dynamics when it comes to their own like advocacy work, for instance.
Okay, thanks. I'll also bring in Francisco, because you have a hand up as well, and then people can pick up different bits from the questions.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Well, I'm Chico. I'm from Rio. I'm teaching. I'm a young scholar. I may say that. I'm teaching at a private university here. I'm doing my postdoc research with João Matiri on marine routes with IPS approach. And I have said that I have a question that bothers me since 2015, 2016. I have made some kinds of the same question that I want to make, is not made right now, but a little bit reframe. I have made that in 2016 in ISA to the IPS roundtable that will happen there. And my question has to do a little bit with what Rael, sorry, I don't know to pronounce your name, but what the question from Rael, that I had the same issue like her. And from my point of view, IPS is a truly European way of critique. And in this kind of way, we in somehow are reproducing the possibilities or way to think or way to research in European way through the West, through, I don't know, through the South Atlantic, South Africa, and whatever. So what I'm trying to say is that if IPS are trying to investigate or trying to refuse or try to respond to the international and knowing that the international is a practice and a production from Europe, so those IPS are just looking for a place to be and be able to critique, but somehow trying to be this place at this global place, even though does not, for me, does not are able to do that, because we are just reinforced or not reinforced or try to critique, but the same aspect or same concept that came from Europe. So that's why maybe post-colonial people were not going to address in IPS journal. I don't know. So I still have this question that's bothered me. I don't have problem to think from IPS approach. I'm doing a postdoc from that perspective or from that intellectual kind of view, but I have a problem when we believe that IPS in somehow is a global way of thinking, a little bit different from how Europeans I think. I think that's my kind of provocative way to be part of this debate. Thank you.
Okay, who wants to pick up some of the comments? Debbie? No, I meant Debbie, Kyle, Nicole. Yeah, We'll do another round when there's new hand. There's no more hands. It's Francisco's hand that's still up.
Why don't we go backwards? So we go Nicole and then Carmen.
We go, all right, we can do another. I thought you would volunteer, but hey, Nicole.
It's such a hard question. You know, like, I don't think IPS as a discipline offers you all answers to any of these questions. I think it just creates a space for us to have these conversations, even when that means, you know, having to have conversations and trying to work through IPS's own limitations. And I agree with you. I think it's a profoundly Eurocentric discipline. But I also think, you know, if you consider it from the perspective of, again, an institutional space from which people can think about, for example, you know, the relationship between their own mental illness and international relations, which, you know, was a really incredible paper that, as the program chair, you know, we accepted and placed onto a panel last semester for the last IPS annual convention, you know, in conversation with other kinds of feminist scholarship, even though they weren't talking directly about things like habitus or sense or fields. It was just really kind of an amazing panel, and the idea that we could have that conversation and just have that moment of reflection together was super important. And so, you know, and I will say, like, when I teach in Beirut and I teach security studies, and, you know, we've had Mark Salter from Security Dialogue come, and we've had Maya Mikdashi, who's an anthropologist, and Paul Amar, who's, again, working across these like transversal fields of policing. And, you know, we do often come to the conclusion that, like, a lot of the theories that either security studies or IPS offer just aren't really relevant. And I think I mentioned this really briefly, but, like, you kind of read all these readings and you have all these conversations, and ultimately you figure out what you're talking about is not security, you're just talking about violence. And so, you know, it's, again, I think it's like creating these spaces or opportunities for encounter so that IPS as a field or as a community, wherever we want to locate that, has an opportunity to be able to kind of reflect on its own limitations, to be able to change its outlook, to be able to approach the ways that we can make it more inclusive, or maybe just to kind of grapple with the fact that it's a bit tragic that we can't. You know, I think that that says something. And also a lot of it has to do with this problem of language. You know, I know Debbie has worked super hard, and it's just taken her a tremendous amount of effort, and I would say even years, and she could speak to this, just getting our abstracts translated into French and Spanish. But IPS still remains a place, and I tell this to my, you know, my interlocutors in Beirut when we're teaching at the summer school, that if they want to submit work to IPS in Arabic, they can. And, you know, we will find a translator to be able to work with them. You know, and that's going to be really hard. And those, you know, those invitations don't, you know, we kind of offer the invitation. We don't always get those manuscripts, but I think that that really differentiates us from other IR journals that either are housed within ISA or otherwise. You know, and I would just like to kind of continue, I think, as an editor, to be able to multiply, you know, those opportunities and spaces for immersion, but also just to, I think, get better at being vulnerable about, you know, when what we're doing is not working in that respect.
Kyle?
So I would echo what Nicole has said, and maybe pick up on the vulnerability aspect a little bit, and to Francisco's point, right, about a European way of critique. What's global about this? And it is that, you know, kind of admission that yes, it is in many ways. And what do? You know, putting the journal to the side, but if you think about it, right, as a particular field, how do you foster the forms of engagement that get you beyond that, right? That get you to think differently about the problems that you are interested in, the kinds of framings of those problems, who you turn to look for ways of engaging with those problems. And being a bit honest where some of that comes from, right? So some of it is social, and we have our networks and communities and ways in which that we're both connected and cut off from one another. I mean, the big elephant in the room, right, is linguistic competency in a lot of places. I live in a country now where it's only a very small minority of people speak something or have any kind of competency in a language other than English. And that's replicated through universities and doctoral programs. So what does that then mean going forward? And thinking these things through and recognizing how many of our colleagues elsewhere learn 2, 3, 4 different languages and put themselves out there in terms of communicating, pretty difficult stuff, not in their native language. And then I think the thing that I think makes IPS unique or different is, one, that there is a general willingness and openness to kind of have those discussions and to show that vulnerability and to be able to say, okay, here's what we're not doing well, or, oh my goodness, why haven't we engaged with this? And wow, look at the way in which this might make us crawl in our own skin, make us uncomfortable, but make us have to rethink the things that we're taking for granted, which you might not necessarily see elsewhere. And in some ways too, I think of IPS, it's one of the few places, and again, thinking of both the journal, but again, as a field where you can have people who are interested in political economy, colleagues who are interested in security, colleagues who might be interested in peace building, colleagues who are interested in kind of more meta-theoretical concerns, and they can get together and have conversations that generally aren't happening elsewhere because of the kind of very fixed and sometimes pretty brutal lines that separate subfields. In terms of our students, practitioners, what can they take from IPS? At the danger of repeating myself, I think it's about a reframing of questions. You can be aware that there are transversal lines and all kinds of things that you're connected to that are influencing things. But does that then shape does it shape the ways in which you're then problematizing what you're trying to do, right? Does it shape the ways in which you see the problems that you're trying to address as a practitioner? Or are you still going to the old repertoires, right? Of, it's a question of this or that. And I think, again, IPS can open up some thinking space there.
Debbie?
Yep, thanks for those questions. I just want to clarify, there is lots of gender work going on in IPS. There's lots of gender analysis. We've published lots of it. We get lots of submissions. It's not that it's not happening and that we're not publishing it. It's just that the character of the type of analysis that is happening around gender has shifted pretty dramatically over the last, I would say, probably 10 years. And I'm just interested in tracking that. I'll talk to my feminist friends and see what they think about it. But that's just, it's not happening. It's just the character is different. So what makes it different? Like, why should you be here? Why should you give a shit? Why should you do IPS, right? Like, because it's the best. And it's the best because it always, always, always unsettles you. And you have to be unsettled, right? If you listen to what Rob said yesterday about the commas, it is the commas in between. You are never, ever allowed to become complacent within one of those 3 spaces, right? Ever. And that's what makes it different, right? And it always, always forces you to refuse the seduction of resolution and redemption, right? It doesn't give you answers. That's what makes it different. And that's what makes it awesome, right? It's turbulent, it's unsettling, it's about puzzles. As Kyle said, it's about reposing questions. And it's always about reminding each other and ourselves to come back to the important questions, right? When we slide away from them, when we get seduced elsewhere, it brings us back to what is at stake. The question of like the difficulty of language, like this is, gosh, this is an argument I've been having a lot. I think we need to do more about writing. This is a slightly different question because I think Kyle and Nicole have answered this really well about language, but there's also something about writing itself, about how we write, how we help each other write, how we mentor each other on how to write, and how we write clearly. I do think that there's a lot more work to do about that, especially when you're working on conceptual stuff. So I want to address this question about the frictions between, or that space between IPS and largely the decolonial, I guess we want to say, that Francesco brought up. I want to start in a different place, and I'll tell you where I want to start. I've been in many Meet the Editor panels or whatever with all the other ISA journals, right? And we've been in Global South Caucus or whatever, and lots of great people in the Global South Caucus are basically like, you're all like white dudes doing like white shit and like coming over to the Global South and like being extractive and horrible, right? And every single editor has responded by saying, oh, but we're doing all these amazing things to like welcome you in and be inclusive into, you know, like, come Global South people, come and do what we do here, right? This is exactly the problem of inclusion that Kyle outlined. I don't start there. I start with a position that international relations is a failed discipline. It has failed, right? The international, of course, is of course fatally compromised by its colonial heritage, etc. We already know that. But if we start with this notion that it is fatally compromised, that gives us a space to have a conversation, right? So some of the most energetic work is precisely in that space between what IPS is doing, constantly jumping back and forth between these three sites, at least three, there's probably about 33, and the real political and ethical claims about the decolonial, right? So that is a very lively space. And like Kyle said, it's about producing conversations and having those conversations. And IPS is a place where those conversations are happening in lively ways, in uncomfortable ways, but in necessary ways. But I don't want to begin my conversation by saying, oh, well, we're going to totally fix it. It's going to be amazing. And we're going to, IPS is totally going to like solve the decolonial. No, absolutely not.
Thanks, Abby. Joao, anyone else? Put your hand up and I'll put you in the list.
Could I respond to Rahel's comment in the chat?
Yes, you can.
Just thanks. I'll say this question about language. I mentioned like language as being really important and language diversity, and Rahel had said it's difficult enough to understand for a native English speaker like myself. And I'll just respond by saying yes. So, you know, like often I find like a lot of what, you know, when I'm teaching these introductory texts and I'm trying to, you know, explain the utility of something like security studies or IPS, you know, to, you know, various groups of students, that I do spend a lot of time just trying to disentangle phrases like paradox of critique or neophilia or, you know, death of security, which even, you know, for, as you mentioned, native English speakers is difficult, and it's especially difficult too for non-English speakers as well. So I just, I do wonder about like whether or not making everything so clear is always the best way to go. And I've done a lot of, you know, consideration about, you know, the sort of obfuscatory kind of disposition of like super theoretical language can also be very helpful for people who are doing research in the field. For example, you know, in spaces of control where they have to worry about their own security and their own safety, but they still want to have a place in the academy and they still want to publish. And so sometimes that overly kind of theoretical or obtuse language can actually help them to make particular kinds of arguments while remaining somewhat invisible to whomever might be reading that work or whomever might be looking at their research. And so this was something that you know, we wrote about in the Beirut School article. I wrote this with my colleagues, and we talked a bit about how thinking about the ethics of obfuscation as part of a posture of criticality and critical inquiry, and how we can use that selectively without ceding rigor, if we're worried about things like imprisonment, or we're worried about things like arrest, or we're worried about things like torture. And that's not something I necessarily have to worry about, but a lot of my students are concerned about this when they want to talk about things like the proliferation of checkpoints or how policing networks operate in Iraq.
Well, thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Jeff. Just two quick comments. Thanks to the panelists for an interesting debate. The first is about IPS being too European. I'm not sure I agree with that. Actually, I would avoid more and more, actually, situating theoretical constructs or epistemologies geographically. I know geoepistemology is big in critical and decolonial places, but more and more I think it attracts a kind of geopolitical thinking that IPS is really trying to resist. And there's a lot of geopolitics going on, and it brings, methodological naturalism back in place. So when we look at the IPS community, well, there's a lot of European people. That's the sociology of the field. But there are a lot of people who publish about decoloniality, publish about using all kinds of knowledges that are not European. On the contrary, I think IPS communities make a big effort to think differently, to think from other places, more than any other, I think, journal that I know, or any other, at least the ISA journals, because most of the ISA journals, what they do is try to teach people from the Global South to write like they do, right? They set up these workshops. Oh, let's teach Global South scholars how to write and publish in ISA journals. So yeah, let's, let them know how an article is framed. So I think all this paternalistic move of inclusion of the Global South scholars in the journals is a failed enterprise. Talking about failed enterprise, it's been 10 years in the ISA of bringing in the Global South to the journal. Give me a break. The Global South will join the journals. I mean, when they can. I mean, it's good to offer resources, translation mostly, right? Access and so forth. But, let's not try so hard, right? Because it really looks like, you're trying to save someone from not publishing in IPS. I mean, we can live with that, right? With not publishing in these journals. So this is about the sociology of the field. People who work in the Global South publish in the Global South mostly. So let's not talking about lament that, how European they are, how Eurocentric. I'm in the Global South. I'm really tired about the lamentations, right? That mostly come from people who are in the North who are lamenting that the people in Global South don't publish there, right? People in the Global South, well, some of them lament, some of them go about their lives normally, right? And if they want to publish an IPS, they will engage, right, with, the stuff, the topics that are there. It's sufficiently open. So, let's not victimize all the time, the people at the margins who cannot publish it. No, right? I think we've done that critique of Eurocentrism. We've done that. We know what it means. So let's move on, right? So that's one thing about the whole Global South thing. The other thing is about, which I find more interesting, is about how we evaluate IPS and what has been brought on in the previous panels. I would disagree that the tone is of lament. I was worried that it would be too celebratory, as usually stuff on IPS is. We celebrate how cool we are, how innovative, how different, which I think what we tried to do in the previous panels is really to look at the limitations, which some of you have brought up here. And I think it's important to take stock after so many years of what we still have to do, what are the challenges. And also it's important when they think about history to think about the past. So it's maybe not a generational thing. I don't think I wouldn't frame it that way. But it is a problem about lineages, yes. It is a problem about trajectories, if you want, more than lineages. And I think it came up in the two panels before us. One is that IPS really tried to deal with the problem of the social in IR, right, from a critical perspective, and that's something that was fairly successful in the beginning. But talking about the discipline and about, you know, the intellectual debates within IR, I think today, if I look at Brazil, if I look at South America, just to stay here, I would say that the social is thought in international studies through constructivism, really. Here we've, in this sense, we've failed because one of the projects of IPS was to engage with critical sociology and see how we could provide critical IR with an interesting sociological critique of what the international is about. And that was very important to engage with the inside-outside problem, which is actually, you know, the social society is a domestic thing. But I think that's still a problem, analytically speaking and conceptually. And a problem also for the younger generations who try to engage with social problems such as violence, policing, race, and are often caught in methodological nationalism. Often caught without, you know, the resources, perhaps sometimes, of problematizing boundaries, you know, thinking about connections, how things circulate. Because in constructivism, it's all about, you know, norm diffusion and internalization of technologies, to internalization of practices, also in the practice turn. So this is one big problem that I think Oliver raised, right? As being perhaps a shortcoming. There's not, I mean, we've perhaps not pursued sufficiently the problem of the social. And I think we have to perhaps to do more in that case. I may be wrong. And at least when I speak, I'm not speaking about the tenure in the journal, but I do speak from the experience I had with Jeff during the time we were editors in the journal. That was always a concern for us. And the second concern raised by Rob, mostly, right, is about the international. I still, you know, that's something that is a concern for me because we did a lot of interesting stuff and fracturing the international, as Jeff and I used to say, and Debbie also has written about a lot in her recent writings. But the question of the international is still out there somehow, and sometimes we cannot see it, at least in the way we conceive politics, wordly, if you like. We cannot see it in our microanalysis, right? In the analysis of singular processes and multiple conflicts. Sometimes we cannot see, and it becomes a political issue because the language to speak about the international, and I'm speaking now about Brazil and Global South, is becoming the language of geopolitics, even among critical thinkers. And I think that's problematic. So I think that's one challenge that we should take. And Rob was, you know, I mean, I don't agree all the time with Rob, but I think he's right. You know, the international is still an important problem. And IR as a discipline is interesting because it expresses the problem of the international. And here I close, sorry, I've spoken too much. But I still think that it's difficult to think about IPS without reflecting on IR as a discipline. I think IR may be dead, but it's a powerful zombie that still goes around eating up the minds of a lot of people. So thanks, guys. Thanks for a very interesting debate.
Thanks, Joao. There are now 3 more hands, so I will go to them. Amna, and then I'll take Beto, and then Raquel.
Thank you for another stimulating panel. I'm a PhD student at the University of Sheffield, and I research the British government's counter-extremism policy, the PREVENT strategy. My question is about how can PhD students and early career researchers contribute to the discussion within IPS, especially when they're coming from outside IPS who haven't developed within IPS, because I situate my research in critical terrorism studies, and as Nicole said, that I have increasingly found that IPS gives me the tools and the language to talk about the problems, or to look at the problem of surveillance and counter-extremism at a micro level. But what Debbie said about the problem of applicationism also resonates with me, where it's like, okay, so when you're new to these concepts, so how true are you being? And this is the sense that I've got over the different panels this week, where a lot of the things that I thought I was doing that were talking to IPS may not necessarily be the case. So how can we join the discussion without falling into these traps, or without not, I don't know, maybe fully using the tools that IPS offers? And here, because I'm a final year PhD student about to enter the job market, I mean contribution in a very instrumental way, where I'm talking about, like, publishing in the journal. So yeah, so sorry, I think I'm taking advantage of this as a publishing advice session, but yeah, how can we avoid the traps and make a meaningful contribution to these discussions? Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Beto?
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Nicole, and João, and you, Jeff, for organizing this. I just want to share a thought, maybe a provocation. I could not help think while listening to the previous commentaries, and also thinking about yesterday a panel in honor of Mike and Mike's work on punctuations, and of course Rob's commentaries on the commas the other day, right? So I'm here suggesting a kind of a supplementary provocation, supplementary, of course, coming from Derrida's engagement with the supplement. So when one thinks about international political sociology, it seems that you have a gravitational noun, right? Governing the construction, which is sociology. The adjectives, international and political, as adjectives, working as supplements. And of course, in sociology, you have the center in sociology being sociology, right? Logos. So I wonder how this supplementarity economy in relation to the international political sociology anchors IPS in a certain way that I understand was problematized by many in these last couple of days. So for example, I read or I listened and read Didier's Bigot problematization of a certain conception of social sciences, right? And commentaries also correlated to humanities. And of course, I read, for example, Mike's work very much in attention with a certain construction of IPS and bringing IPS much more closer to a certain conception of humanities and a certain construction of social science and humanities. So on the one hand, I would love to hear you guys about this, what I'm calling this economy between adjectives and nouns. And on the other hand, and I think maybe even more importantly, I was wondering, and maybe, you know, a provocation to Rob as well, I wonder if the comma works only in between these adjectives and the noun, or if we can imagine commas before the I and after the S. So before the international and after sociology, right? So what would be the economy, the political economy of the commas? Are we imagining commas just in between international, political, and sociology? What would be to imagine commas gaming and playing and working before the international, the I, and after the sociology, the S? A provocation and a thought. Thanks.
Thanks, Beto. Great question, great provocation. I like that. Amna? Oh no, Amna has been. Rahel.
Yeah, I don't want to sound provocative, but it was just some of the things that Jean said that I kind of feel like they want to talk to. This whole idea of, journals being Eurocentric because they're not, publishing thoughts from the global South. I mean, of course, personally, I find it very corny. And I've seen those type of workshops before too, where, academics or, journals would be very paternalistic and like say like, okay, this is what you have to do to publish in these journals. At the same time, though, when we think about, kind of the everyday issues that not only, people from the global South experience, but also the way that, politics plays out in the West, right? Obviously, a lot of policymakers are not reading peer-reviewed journals, right? A lot of people do not have access to peer-reviewed journals because of, of course, how much it costs to have access to it. Of course, those who are privileged to, be students or working at a university should have access to their university. But besides the whole, why should we publish anywhere, knowing that people do not have easy access to our work and all that type of stuff. I think the kind of Eurocentric or I don't say Eurocentric, but this IPS comes across as being a European problem because the questions that it's asking, I think, right? I'm reminded of Frantz Fanon's words in The Wretched of the Earth, where he talks about Europe's is never done talking or defining what man is, and that we would be well off if we would just stop obsessing with any type of desire to catch up with Europe. I feel that's also the situation when it comes to defining this what is the global, how it's interconnected. I mean, it doesn't take a university degree for most people to, at least from the global South, to understand that. Or for instance, the asylum seeker who has been in fact human trafficked, but finally finds himself in a safe place, but have to deal with like so much racism. Of course, they can contemplate what's happening to them, the amount of surveillance that that they go through, or even like the type of answers they have to give when they are filling out that application for the risks of giving their fingerprints in Italy when their final destination is Sweden or Norway or Germany for that matter. They know these things. Only things that they don't are they're not writing these things in academic journals that they just don't have access to anyway. Yeah, basically my point is just that the European question comes more across what is the basic thing, not whether or not people from the global South or post-colonial subjects are writing. People are writing and people are thinking outside of all these academic journals, and they're probably, and some of them are actually earning a lot more money than we are, I think, when it comes to publishing.
Miguel, I'm going to pass back to the panel, but can I make a comment about language very quickly as well? I'm also not very lamenting. I think it's a very exciting space, IPS, what's happening. And I speak from experience by visiting all kinds of PhD workshops around IPS. So, but on language, I think the transparency of language is a very interesting tool, because it's of course also quite disciplining about you have to have a capacity to write in transparent ways, which not everyone has. And you just read through the capacity to speak in particular ways. It's a trained capacity, but it's also a predisposed class-related and kind of capacity. So I think actually we should be careful about language. But the second thing about language and transparency that I also find interesting is that to some extent, IR is a social science knowledge, and some of these things can only be articulated in a kind of scholarly body of work, where the different languages that are being used are quite technical, and they're sometimes very hard to deal with and to go through, because we're trained in particular ways of thinking. So if you want to challenge these, there are conceptual work that needs to be done that is actually hard and possibly, and I can tell you because I've just started reading some bits of Deleuze, seriously this time, not visually, and I get continuously lost because there is all kinds of wording that I don't fully get because of the background from which it comes. But if I want to get to it, if I believe there is a serious problem, I'm going to have to read it in that way, because that's where the moving happens. So I think there is an element of a transparency of language that I think is also quite problematic. And I think when Nicole said there are things that you have to express in things that also might help and so on, I think that is interesting. But I thought I would raise that because this is often done as if we have to write transparently, but not all people are actually capable of writing in the same transparency that or capable they might be, but they have different backgrounds in which they come in. But anyway, I had other comments, but we are running out of time, so I'm going to pass it back to the panelists. Shall we go in the order, the other way around now, Debbie? Debbie first, Nicole, and then, oh no, Debbie, Kyle, okay. Nicole. Or we can do Nicole, Kyle. It doesn't matter.
Okay, we're quickly running out of time, so I want to go really quickly. Just to Anna, the question, I mean, there's a lively, excellent set of groupings in different places of the world called Doing IPS. So the first thing I would say is like join Doing IPS. Okay, so contact Jeff, and Jeff, you can send all that information to the students, because one of the things about IPS is it's a collective endeavor and you do it with other people, right? Kids don't do IPS alone, right? Do it with other people. And that's also about linked to questions about writing, right? Because one of the things that we need to get better at is sharing our work and critiquing each other's work in the stage of formation. And that's what Doing IPS, I think, does really, really well. Just a quick point on this question of transparency and writing. Transparency is a political question. Transparent to whom? For what purpose? I mean, it's like the basic stuff about meaning. So we can't just, we can't just offer transparency without unpacking it, right? And that's deeply related to the question of thinking and writing and meaning. And then finally, just to go to Beto's question about the supplement. I don't see it like that at all. I don't see sociology as the anchor with these two other sort of adjectives or whatever. If we think about the supplement in Derrida's way, it's consistently about disruption, unsettling, and of course, haunting. So we're back to zombies, right? Which is also where we were always going to end. But it's the traversing in between those three constantly. I see it as a circulation between the three. It's never, ever, ever. It never rests in equilibrium. It's not about it's not the Morgenthau balance of power. It's not that. It is never that. It's very, very turbulent. So on the note of zombies, I will hand over to Kyle.
Okay, conscious that time is running out. What Debbie said on the last question, to Rahel's interventions, one thing that I found helpful in trying to think these things through, there's a book, it's called Blues in African American Literature, a Vernacular Theory by Houston Baker Jr., and particularly that notion of vernacular theory, the ways in which people who aren't in the spaces that we're in are able to theorize and articulate the ways in which their worlds work and don't work, is incredibly important. And to the question of how can ECRs contribute to IPS, you've got energy, you've got a unique take, you're not as jaded as we are. So it's about asking those really interesting questions, right? And oftentimes asking those questions that you kind of say to yourself, why hasn't anybody asked it? Have the confidence to do it, because generally it's because you're bringing something new and fresh and you're looking at things in a way that haven't been looked at before.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone who attended for their questions, and it's given me a lot to think about. I think, you know, what you've all mentioned really deserves a lot more attention and I think reflection than I'm able to untangle in the 1 minute that I have. And, you know, I just want to say that, you know, Kyle and I are going to be kind of talking about this conversation and kind of, you know, how we want to move forward with the journal, or how we're moving forward with the journal as well. So we're looking forward to continuing it. And if you want to get in contact with us just to sort of continue it, please do feel free to email me, email us. I'll put my email in the chat as soon as I finish talking, because I can't do 2 things at once. But, you know, I will say that, like, at least from my perspective, I'm not really here to kind of provide you know, some type of new paradigm for doing IPS. You know, I just want to emphasize the importance of praxis, location, and I think the kinds of moral economies that we participate in, either when we run these kinds of workshops or you know, we speak at them, or in our publishing. You know, and always, and the fact that IPS, I think, is, you know, in the sense of language and translation, I think it's always already incomplete in its translation and application in different research contexts and lived experiences. So I would just emphasize that, but I will also say that, you know, I do think what I like about it is that it allows for itself to be treated as an ethnographic object. And so I would ask us to, you know, continue to treat it as such, I suppose. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the 3 panels we organized around histories, trajectories, perspectives of IPS, which I found actually extremely interesting to hear the different perspectives of it, and so we'll take away a lot from this. But you know, the winter school hasn't finished yet. In an hour's time, we have a roundtable on global health and the politics of COVID-19. Yes, indeed. And then tomorrow morning, we have the workshop, still for those of you who actually were also participating in the morning courses. And then we conclude with a roundtable on an international political sociology of the new right. Tomorrow, I think it's 2 Rio time, right? At 2 o'clock Rio time. But for today, no, not for today, for now, and for the sessions on the panels we organized, I would like to thank the 3 speakers, Debbie, Kyle, and Nicole, a lot. Thanks very much, guys, for coming and joining, and also the previous speakers who joined in the panel, and for you all to join, for Renata to keep an eye on the chat and so on, so that I don't lose track of it, and for always being in the background helping, and Joao for, you know, initiating and setting it all up together with Beto. All right, guys, I'll see some of you, hopefully several of you, in an hour when we start discussing global health and the politics of COVID-19. But in the meantime, you know, have a coffee wherever you are. It would be nice to have a coffee together, as I've said, or a drink would even be better, or caparina, or whatever. But anyway, you'll have to do it and simulate it in your own place where you are. So see you all in an hour.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.